In this video, we are going to be looking at Aristotle's ideas on property, family, and slavery. We've already seen Plato's ideas on the same. Now we are going to look at Aristotle's theory. Aristotle's theory is based on a critique of Plato's communism. For Aristotle, property provides the psychological satisfaction by fulfilling the human instinct for possession and ownership. I repeat, for Aristotle, property provides the psychological satisfaction by fulfilling the human instinct for possession and ownership. Aristotle begins his theory by being a critique of Plato's communism. Aristotle concludes that communism of property leads to conflicts, for the producing class is allowed to own property while the guardians are not. We saw before that Plato's communism only applies to the guardians, that is to the rulers and soldiers. It excludes the producing class from its ambit. So Aristotle concludes that communism of property leads to conflicts because the producing class is allowed to own property while the guardians are not. Aristotle, with regards to ownership of property, says A. Individual ownership, individual use. Aristotle condemns such use of property. Second one, common ownership, individual use. Situation that begins with socialism and ends with capitalism. This is also not agreeable to Aristotle. The third one is common ownership, common use. This is an impractical device. The fourth one that Aristotle says is that individual ownership, common use. This is possible and equally acceptable. So these are the four types of ownership of property that Aristotle looks at. That is individual ownership, individual use, common ownership, individual use, common ownership, common use, individual ownership, common use. So the best way for Aristotle is to look at individual ownership, common use. Property ought to be generally and in the main private but common in use. I repeat, property ought to be generally and in the main private but common in use. Aristotle was against concentration of wealth or amassing of great wealth by an individual. I repeat, Aristotle was against great concentration of wealth or amassing of great wealth by an individual. So we now look at Aristotle's ideas on family. Aristotle advocates the private family system. Family is the primary unit of social life and comprises the society. We saw previously that Plato advocates a communism of families or communism of wives. This means that there is no private family system according to Plato. However, Aristotle advocates the private family system. He says that family is the primary unit of social life and comprises the society. Quoting Aristotle, for that which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of common interest. For besides other consideration, everybody is more inclined to neglect something which he expects another to fulfill. So, in critique of Plato's communism, Aristotle says that for that which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of common interest. For besides other considerations, everybody is more inclined to neglect something which he expects another to fulfill. Family is the primary school of social virtue, where a child gets lessons of qualities such as cooperation, love, tolerance and sacrifice. So Aristotle says that family is the primary school of social virtue. It is in the family that a child learns lessons of qualities such as cooperation, love, tolerance and sacrifice. We cannot do away with the private family. This is what Aristotle says. The family is not merely a primary association, but it is a necessary unit of a society. Without a family, the society will crumble. If man is a social animal, family becomes the extension of man's nature. The village is an extension of the families, and the state is an extension and union of families and villages. So Aristotle keeps repeating this point where he says that the state is an extension and union of families. So if man is a social animal, family becomes the extension of man's nature, the village an extension of the families, and the state an extension and union of families and villages. A family consists of husband, wife, children and slaves. There are three relationships: marital, parental and master-slave. So in spite of all of these good things about Aristotle, he continues to advocate slavery. Aristotle was also a product of his times, that much is clear. So let's look at Aristotle's views on slavery. Aristotle in many ways is a conservative. Slavery was normal during those times and Aristotle advocates slavery. I repeat, Aristotle in many ways is a conservative. Slavery was normal during those times and Aristotle advocates slavery. Some should rule and others be ruled. This is not only necessary but expedient as well. From the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjection, others for rule. So, Professor Maxey, echoing Aristotle, says the following: they lack somehow the quality of soul that distinguishes the free man and master. Consequently, it is just that they should be held as property and used as property and as a means of maintaining life. So clearly, Professor Maxey, echoing Aristotle, says that the slaves are to be used as property and they are somehow of a lower quality of soul than the masters. In response to the question, why should one person be a slave while other remains a master, Aristotle said the following: for he who can be and therefore is, others and he who participate in the rational principle enough to apprehend but not have such a principle is a slave by nature, and one who is one's own and participates in the rational principles because he has such a principle is a master. So what does this mean? This means that if a person can understand a rational principle but he cannot have such a principle or follow such a principle, then he is a slave. And the one who is able to have such principles and follow such principles, then he becomes a master. So Aristotle is clearly defending slavery here. Slavery is natural because nature does not admit equality. It is a necessity because if a master needs the slave to enjoy a free life, then the slave needs the master to attain the virtues of a free man. So Aristotle says that slavery is natural because nature does not admit equality. So Aristotle says that equality is not the default position. Please remember this. Aristotle says that equality is not the default position. Slavery is natural because nature does not admit equality. Slavery is necessary because if a master needs the slave to enjoy a free life, then the slave needs the master to attain the virtues of a free man. A slave, according to Aristotle, is not a human being. He is subhuman, incomplete, and a barbarian. He is an animate, a means for action, and is not intended for production. For he helps in the business within the household, he belongs to the master. So Aristotle is saying that the slave is subhuman, he is incomplete and a barbarian. He is an animate and just a means for action, and he is not intended for production in the society, but he just helps with the business within the household. He belongs to the master. Clearly, Aristotle has a very poor view of slaves, and he says that they are nothing but animate objects and they belong as property to the master. Aristotle thankfully rejects inhumane treatment of slaves and advocates their emancipation as a reward for their good behavior. This is the only positive thing to come out of Aristotle's theory of slavery, where he rejects inhumane treatment of slaves and advocates their emancipation as a reward for their good behavior. This concludes Aristotle's theory of slavery as well. We will continue with Aristotle in the next video. Thank you.